Welcome back, everybody. Let me, the saga of what has happened to me. Some of you may remember I didn't teach during the fall semester because I had a tear in the cartilage that holds the ball and socket together in my left hip. So it was a severe tear. I knew it was serious, and I thought I was going to end up having surgery. But they decided not to do surgery because, unfortunately, it looks like I'll have to have this hip replaced in a couple of years anyway. So they told me at the time that the recovery from the surgery I would have had was going to be pretty serious and would take 6 months for me to heal. And that rather than go through this twice, they told me, get physical therapy, see if you can't stand it for another couple of years. So I said, great. So my first day out, I'm going to a performance at Johnson County Community College to see 3 women who are singing the songs of Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, and Nina Simone, some of my favorite music. And so my husband and I went off to Johnson County Community College. And of course, I'm hurrying to get to the parking lot below a little too quickly, and I miss the curb. And down I go, and I break my ankle. But people who know me know I often just ignore things. And so I didn't do anything about it after I fell, which was on a Sunday. So on Wednesday, I had a normal doctor's appointment. My doctor took a look at my foot and he says, I don't know. He said, I'm going to send you for an x-ray. Meanwhile, I was going down to Texas to see my grandson that weekend. And so I get the results on Thursday and they tell me, yes, it's broken. And you have to go right away to get something put on it so that you stabilize it because you can't bear any weight on it. And I tell them, no, I'm going to Texas. I'll sit in the back seat of the car. I'll be fine. And the doctor called me up again and says, you've got to go in and take care of this. So that's the origin of the picture that ended up in Spark. You know, really trying to prove to my grandson I couldn't go. I took the picture so he could see I was incapacitated. I sent it to Carolyn, who sent it to Spark, and lo and behold, I ended up a star. So that's the story. So I think I have to have this on for another 6 weeks. I don't know. I go in next week and they kind of assess how well I'm doing. So that's, they called it an acute fracture. So that's where I am on my leg. But the good news is it's all mechanical. And really, if I had known I was not going to need or I wasn't going to get surgery, I would have taught last semester because really there was nothing wrong. However, I did have the opportunity to watch my good friend Doug Shear, who offered a course about American history through art. And so I truly enjoyed that. And I realized how much I'm missing by, you know, teaching here so much and spending so much time on prep that I haven't had time to enjoy some of the other offerings that are here at Spark, which are always such high quality. So that's the story of the legs. All right, now the second thing, I know everybody has read that I am supposed to be teaching about Japan, and I know some people may be disappointed that I am not. Yesterday, I told the class that the first 2 lessons were going to be on the Ukraine, but judging on how much I covered yesterday, it's going to be at least 3. But my goal is to really have an opportunity to have some class discussion. Also, to have people with questions out in Zoom land to send me questions so that we can address them in class. This is really a complicated subject. And some of you may have heard Putin make the kinds of comments like, Ukraine really isn't a country. Ukraine never really existed. And so I thought today that we would take a look at Ukraine in historical perspective as well as Russia in historical perspective. And those of you who have been with me, I have taught virtually everything I will be re-mentioning about Russia at one time, at some time earlier. So I'm hoping that people will begin to start to see how you kind of reach back into the past to understand the present. So that is basically what I plan to do. Let's see. All right, well, I think we ought to get started since time is precious. I'd like everybody, if you would, to take out the map that appears up here on the board, the map of Ukraine. And I'm going to start with an introduction, a very quick introduction. Okay, I've got some kind of a request on here, Lori. Have you seen it?
No, because it came to you instead of to me.
Okay, we need live transcription.
Okay, that we can do. All right. And since I'm standing up here for our folks on Zoom, since you have the maps in front of you and you can see the map behind Carol, is that sufficient? If it's not, send a chat to Lori and let me know, and I will try to share the screen. Otherwise, we're going to leave it the way it is.
Okay. All right, this is just a quick introduction to what took place. On the 24th of February, 2022, Russia began a military invasion of Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russo Ukrainian conflict that began in 2014. You'll recall in 2014, Putin grabbed Crimea. We'll be discussing that. It is the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II. And so this is, of course, why we have circled back. Theoretically, this is a course in Western civilization, and my plan is ultimately to end this course in Europe. Ukrainians fleeing the country, the invasion also caused the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Currently, there are approximately 3.6 million refugees. Most of those refugees have gone to Poland, so they have gone north. So if you're looking at your map, it's very important to have kind of an orientation. You have up here Belarus. Belarus is a former Soviet socialist republic. You'll recall that the Soviet Union was ultimately made up of 15 Soviet republics. The leader of Belarus today is a dictator named Lukashenko. And recently, Putin was having military exercises with Belarus, but has kind of kept those troops in place in order to make a move on Kyiv. The reason they are trying to get to Kyiv is because Kyiv, as the capital, is very important because you generally assume that when the capital falls, the country has fallen. Now, I'm going to tell you outright, many people thought that somehow this war was going to be averted. I didn't. I always thought that the war was coming. And the primary reason for that is because the Russians had taken Crimea in 2014, and therefore they were unable to reach this landmass by direct overland route. So when you start to hear about all of the fighting that is going on here in Mariupol, Mariupol has about 400,000 people. This is really a scorched earth policy. What Putin is attempting to do is, this is Russia, is to create a land bridge that will retake all the territory along the Black Sea because this territory came to Russia in the 1760s under the Tsarina Catherine the Great. This is where Sevastopol, this is where the Russians have their southern fleet. And the former ruler of Ukraine, we'll get to names because they get complicated later, but the former ruler of Ukraine was very pro-Russian. He had just renewed a lease agreement with the Russians for an additional 25 years. And all of this is going to be in the notes. I'm really just trying to get a broad overview here. So he, of course, wanted to be sure that they would have no difficulties continuing to house the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. So when the former ruler of Ukraine was overthrown in 2014, Putin immediately secured Crimea. Now, the people living in Crimea are principally Russian. But at least 90% of the population in Crimea is Russian because, you know, government jobs, the fleet, all of that kind of thing. There are approximately 1 million people living here. So Putin felt that historically this had been a Russian port. It had been a Russian port actually until the independence of all of these former Soviet republics in 1991. But more specifically, when Nikita Khrushchev was in power in the 1950s, in 1954, Khrushchev transferred the Crimea from direct Russian control and gave Crimea to Ukraine. So when Ukraine gains its independence, it gets Crimea, something I'm sure that the government of Russia never ever anticipated, that somehow this mighty empire of 15 republics would somehow just fall apart. Now, I'm going to continue. So you can see there's no land bridge. This area, the Sea of Azov into the Black Sea, is the closest. That is called the Kerch Strait. The Russians, once they took Crimea, built a bridge, the Kerch Bridge, so that they would have some direct access. But it's fraught with all kinds of problems if you want to really supply Crimea directly. And so, in my estimation, the true goal of this invasion is to retake all of the territory along the Black Sea that had been gained during the time period of Catherine the Great, so that they would clearly have a land bridge that connected them. Now, there's a lot of other reasons why Putin is justifying this invasion. Most of all, it has to do with NATO. NATO has been allowing the former Soviet republics of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia to join NATO right up against the Russian border. Russia was concerned that Ukraine, which they consider almost a mystical part of Russia, that Ukraine, with the second largest economy of any of the former republics, Russia being the largest, that somehow the loss of control over Ukraine when the pro-Russian leader was overthrown in 2014, that this then signaled that a pro-Western government would apply for NATO membership. And by the way, that did happen. So I think basically what he has been doing is trying to take these cities. And this is why when you see on television the names, they're fighting. First of all, you've got to imagine there's Russian troops down there. They've been there since 2014. When they took it in 2014, they carried out a referendum, a yes or no vote, and asked the people, primarily Russian, if they wanted to be a part of Russia. They indicated they did. The West was kind of found themselves flat-footed, also kind of thinking, well, Crimea historically has been part of Russia. Bottom line is, even though nobody has officially recognized that Crimea is actually a part of Russia, they've kind of accepted that kind of de facto it is. So the other areas that you keep hearing about, excuse me, are the areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. And I'd like to explain a little bit about those two territories. Once again, as you can see, they're right up against Russia. This is the industrial area of Ukraine. There is not a majority population of Russians in this area. I will give you some actual figures a little bit later. But there is a predominant Russian population in the city of Donetsk and in the city of Luhansk. So when Russia went to war, when Russia grabbed Crimea in 2014, there was a separatist movement going on in Donetsk and in Luhansk to become part of, or I don't know if they wanted to become part of Russia, but basically what they did want to do was separate from Ukraine. The Russians are going to support that separatist movement in both of these areas. Right before the invasion occurred, I'll say one more thing and then I'll move on. In 2014, when they made a peace agreement, hopefully a peace agreement, to stop the fighting in these separatist regions over here, the name of the first agreement was Minsk I. Minsk is the capital of Belarus. So they made an agreement to have a ceasefire and to restore peace. It didn't hold. They then had another agreement called Minsk II, in which the fighting kind of stopped, but then it kind of resumed again in 2016. So when Putin this time invaded, the day before his invasion, he recognized these two areas as completely independent states. Now, at the Minsk II agreement, the government of Ukraine agreed that they would allow these two provinces to literally govern themselves, that they could be autonomous regions, but they still remained a part of Ukraine. So the day before the invasion actually occurred, Putin announces that these two places are now completely independent states. And so he does that and the invasion begins. Now, let's just kind of take a look at, I'm going further than I wanted to right now. So I think I'm going to back off and we'll see. Let me stay with this map for a minute. Some of the places that you're seeing on television that are constantly in the news. Lviv, all right, this is an area where most of the refugees are meeting in order to find their way into Poland. Another place, and Kyiv, by the way, has approximately, let's say, 3 to 3.5 million people living there. Another place where you see them fighting is Kharkiv. What the Russians did was they took their army and they had approximately 200,000 troops. And they basically encircled the entire border, including the troops that had been involved in the exercises up in Belarus. They made an attempt to carry out a typical military strategy, which would be to encircle the city, cut it off from everybody else, and then carry out a siege against the city. They have been completely unable to achieve that goal. As a matter of fact, they haven't taken any of the major cities. But as the Russian troops came out of this area, they started to move to the west in an attempt to get to Odessa. And some of you may remember having spoken about Odessa before. Many years ago now, we spoke about Odessa as being a place that Catherine the Great met with the Austrian Emperor Joseph II, and she was trying to encourage him to take over more territory from the Turks. The Turks would be down here. I should have said this earlier. Initially, this entire area here belonged to the Ottoman Turk Empire. So when Catherine the Great took this territory here in the south, she took the territory from the Turks, but she was pretty hungry as far as land goes, and she invited the Austrian emperor to tour the city in a carriage. And she had her lover at the time, Potemkin, build like a movie set in the city of Odessa, literally houses on each side of the street that did not exist. And they go down the street, and the Russians bring in all of these happy, laughing, nationalistic people. And she's trying to convince them, you see how much happier the people are under Russian rule. We need to take some more territory from the Turks, and we'd like Austria to support us. Now, what interfered with all of this is ultimately going to be the French Revolution, but I'm not going to get into that right now. So that's Odessa, and Odessa is very important because it is one of the best deep water port. It is the best deep water port on the Black Sea. Now, if you ask me, what do I think is going to happen? The Russians have about 80% of this corridor. They don't have Mariupol, and that's why Mariupol is so important. But the Russian troops have been moving this way, and they're moving this way, and there's fierce fighting going on in Kherson, Mykolaiv, which I'm sure you've heard on television. And now with the Russian troops, since they can't take this city, they're actually trying to go around, but their final goal is to take Odessa. I think ultimately what the Russians want is to annex all of this territory. I don't think anyone will ever let them take Odessa because Ukraine, as a sovereign state, needs to have an outlet to the sea. And consequently, and they have not taken it, but they are bombarding it from the sea. Now, all in all, at this moment, the army of the Russians has not been successful in any place whatsoever. And if you've been watching the leader, Zelensky, he has done more to unite NATO after almost seeing NATO fall apart during the last administration than any single human being could have hoped to achieve. He is a master statesman. He has spoken to the American Congress, vis-a-vis, I guess, Zoom, and used all of these very nationalistic kinds of references in American history, our commitment to civil liberties, our commitment to democracy, and so forth. And he got a rousing kind of reception. He also spoke to the British Parliament, and there he quotes very liberally from Winston Churchill. He also, just last week, went to the Knesset and tried to get Israel to align behind him. One of the things that Putin is claiming is that this country is somehow being overrun by neo-Nazis. Now, this is such an absurd kind of a claim, primarily because Zelensky is Jewish. He is an individual whose family, many members of his family, lost their lives during the Holocaust. But the term neo-Nazi in Russia is like anathema because that resurrects to the Russians fighting against Germany. So to somehow suggest that neo-Nazis are overrunning the country, he has told his own people that the people of Ukraine want him to liberate them from neo-Nazi control. Now, he can control information pretty much in Russia, but he doesn't control information in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians have been able to keep their internet on. In fact, kind of an interesting thing that happened the very day after the invasion, as the troops started to get into their tanks, they were trying to shut down the internet in Ukraine, but Microsoft saw the attack and responded, keeping all of this open. Zelensky himself is a native Russian speaker. He has been directly speaking to these Russian troops who really don't want to be invading this country. This country with about 44 million people, 20 million of them, half of them have relatives that live in Russia. A third also have friends that live in Russia. So this is an unpopular war for the Russian troops who think they're going to go there and liberate this country, finding out once they get there and have access to Ukrainian news that this is not at all the case. And they're having difficulty actually convincing people in Russia that people from Ukraine trying to influence their family back in Russia, that this actually is not an invasion. And of course, they've never used that term. So anyway, just to see the surrounding nations. Got Moldova over here, you've got Romania here, the Slovak Republic, Hungary, Poland, Belarus. So 44 million people. Russia has about 146 million people living in it. The largest economy would be Russia of the former Soviet republics, second only to Ukraine. The per capita income in this country is approximately $12,500. Okay, so that's my little introduction there, little long. And we are going to come back to this map, but I just thought it was important to kind of get the geography out of the way right from the start so you know where we're going. Now, again, Putin is making the claim that this is a made-up country. And today, that's one of the things that we're going to try to take a look at, okay? So let's take out our outline and we're going to change, okay, to that first map. And you've got your outline. And as I said before, if you've been with me during this course on Western civilization, this is going to be material I think that's going to sound familiar to you. So the people living, all right. The people that live in the area we call the Balkans, which is the area directly on top of Greece, the people there are Slavic in background. So that is their ethnicity. The Slavic people in that area are going to become members of the Greek Orthodox Church. As history goes on, the Russian Orthodox Church breaks away from the Greek Orthodox Church in about 1589. Many of the people today that live in Ukraine are Russian Orthodox or some form of Orthodox. So when we look at the history of Russia, this area here is original Russia. This area was called Muscovy. Now, first thing you want to realize is the vast size of this nation. Russia today is still the largest country on the face of the earth, bar none. It covers many time zones. The people living in this portion of Russia, about here, are European in background. So approximately 1/3 of Russia is European, but 2/3 of Russia is in Asia. The royal family that is ultimately going to come into power, the Romanov family, they are European in background. And they were always anxious to have the country face west. And so for many years, we kind of saw that Russia echoed the development of the other European powers. Now, my course, when I began it, started in the Middle Ages, and then we did the Renaissance. So I'm not all that familiar with this part of Europe, except kind of peripherally. So I'm starting at letter A. Ukraine was the site of the first Eastern Slavic state in the 10th and the 11th centuries. It was called Kievan Rus, and its headquarters was in Kiev. It was the largest and the most powerful state in Europe. Europe during the Middle Ages, you'll recall, was really disunified. They don't begin to create nation states in Europe until approximately 1500. So in the 10th and the 11th century, we are deep in the Middle Ages, and Eastern Europe obviously had a fairly advanced empire called the Eastern Slavic state, or Kievan Rus. The second, weakened by internal disorder and the Mongol invasion of Europe, 1237 to 1242, Muscovy and Eastern Europe fell under Mongol control. This is something we teach very briefly in American schools. But Genghis Khan is going to conquer the largest empire in human history. And if you think about Genghis Khan, and well, we don't have China up there, but if you imagine China the size of the United States, right on top of it is Mongolia. The Mongols have very low population, but they were incredibly good horsemen. They had some technological advancements that enabled them to kind of jump out of Mongolia, conquer China. And that's when the Mongols came to power in China We sometimes now call that empire the Yuan Empire. But all of you know about this empire because this was the empire that Marco Polo in about 1300 went with his uncles to the court of Kublai Khan. So that tells you immediately that China at this time was under Mongol control. So they not only had China, they also took over all of this territory as well as Eastern Europe. But as I told you before, there's no people living here. So they can't actually occupy the area. So they set up what we call a tributary system. In a tributary system, you install either local rulers that are friendly to you, or you put one of your own in control of the area. And then basically you allow that area to govern itself autonomously as long as they send tribute or taxes to the central government, which was now being located in Beijing, the Mongol Empire. So that's what we are referring to here with letter B. Weakened by internal disorder and the Mongol invasion of Europe, Muscovy and Eastern Europe fall under Mongol control. The Mongols, unable to occupy the vast area, established a tribute system and allowed a high degree of autonomous self-government. The Khan of the Golden Horde ruled Russia until 1480. So Russia doesn't get rid of Mongol control until 1480. And now we're going to start to see the development of monarchy or czardom in Russia. In 1480 to 1505, Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, freed Russia from the Mongols and consolidated power under Muscovite rule. And that's when this brown area was the extent of Russia. We are fast forwarding, obviously. In 1613, well, let me explain this first. Before 1613, there had been a long period in Russian history that is referred to as the time of troubles. Just like in Western Europe, before we had kings in Europe, there were many, many powerful nobles, and each of the nobles had their own private army. Well, imagine that basically the same situation existed. Russia also had a system of serfdom very similar to what we see in Western Europe. So in about a 50 to 100 year period before 1613, the nobles in Russia, the boyars, are fighting against each other, and there's great instability in this vast area. So at some point, the nobles got together and decided to elect a king, but they didn't trust each other. They didn't want to elect one of them, their own. So they elected instead a 16-year-old boy who was part of the nobility named Michael Romanov, and he then became the first Tsar of Russia. Michael Romanov, as he grows into his role, is going to attempt to consolidate the state. So that is the beginning of the Romanov dynasty. And Russia has never had any other royal family. The Russian dynasty goes from 1613 until 1917, when Nicholas II is overthrown in the middle of the First World War. So the Romanov dynasty. Okay, let's see if it makes sense. In 1613, after a series of civil wars in Russia, Mikhail Romanov was coronated Tsar at age 16, ending the instability known as the Time of Troubles. His coronation brought the Romanov dynasty to power. We're now jumping ahead to Peter the Great, the people in Russia that have added territory to this area. Now, Peter the Great, if you were with me, you know he was a giant of a man. He was an absolute genius. He went off to the West in order to learn the latest technology, particularly as it referred to naval warfare. At this time, all trade between Russia and Europe took place from this port called Archangel. This port, however, is a cold water port, and that means that it ices over in the winter. The Europeans basically were importing from Russia things like timber, they're building ships and this kind of thing. So one of the things that Russia desperately needed is what we call a warm water port. And another term for that is here, a window to the West. So Peter the Great goes off to Western Europe, goes back to Russia, and now he decides that if Russia is not going to fall to Western penetration, he's got to build up his army and he needs a navy. So he goes to war with Sweden and Finland in what is known as the Great Northern War. This war comes to an end in 1721. From Sweden and Finland, it was a joint monarchy, he takes the city of St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg is up on the Baltic Sea. And it is a port that doesn't freeze over, therefore allowing trade between Russia and the West. So I think it's fair to say that historically, Russia follows a European pattern, but it's always about 50 to 100 years behind. So Peter the Great, let's see what he does here. And he kicking and screaming, he pulls this country together. Peter the Great, 1689 to 1725, built a new capital at St. Petersburg after winning the territory from Sweden in the Great Northern War. He modernized the army, built a Russian navy, and reorganized the government. His modernization was designed to prevent Western penetration from the West. St. Petersburg became Russia's first, what we call, window to the West, a warm water port that enabled year-round trade with Europe on the Baltic Sea. Okay, now I want to just speak a moment about what his motivation was. Right next door to Russia, and we'll see it on another map in a moment, is the country of Poland. Poland is a country that was made up of what was called the Lithuanian Duchy and the Polish crown, and they merged this giant country together. At one time in history, Poland was the largest country in Europe. Today, the largest country in Europe is the Ukraine. The Ukraine is approximately the size of Texas. So wow, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. So here you have this giant country of Poland, but the Polish nobles, who are called the Szlachta, they were supposed to get together to elect a king. It was an elected monarchy. But they were so fearful of one another that they didn't want to elect one of their own who would then rise up and dominate the rest, which is primarily what happened in the West. In the West, we also kind of started out with elected kings. Usually the strongest noble became the king, He had the biggest army. His other nobles also had armies. And as he rose in power with the help of the middle class, he built his army up even more, and he conquered all the other nobles, and then eventually outlaws what is called livery and maintenance, making it illegal for other nobles to have their own private armies. So if you can imagine Poland as being made up of all of these nobles, and they were an extraordinarily rich group of nobles, the Schlochter. They were the most powerful aristocracy in Europe. And if you travel to Poland, you will see that there are many what I will call mini Versailles, because they build these incredible palaces because they're living off the labor of their serfs. So the Poles basically didn't want to elect one of their own, and consequently, they ended up electing usually a Swedish king, a Russian king, maybe a Prussian king to lead them. The problem with this is that the country never consolidated and never became a major power, because these boyars were busy, these Schlochter were busy fighting with each other. Eventually, and I'm kind of jumping ahead here, these nobles are going to be fighting among themselves, leaving themselves open to foreign invasion. And in the 1700s, there are going to be 3 partitions of Poland. Catherine the Great is going to be in power during all 3 partitions. And her part of Poland is going to be northern Ukraine. So now Russia's got the south, right, from the Turks. And now, because the Polish monarchy is falling apart, Russia is now picking up the northern portion as well. Now, hopefully, this will make sense. All right, now Catherine the Great, she comes with a lot of stories, mostly about her insatiable sexual appetite, but we're not going to investigate that today. I've done that, people. There were no horses. In 1762, Catherine II. So who's Catherine II? Catherine II, there is a kingdom of Prussia. Prussia is eventually going to become Germany. Frederick the Great is ruling in Prussia. He wants influence in Russia. There is a, kind of a German quarter in Moscow. He convinces the Romanov ruler at the time to marry Catherine, a Prussian princess, off to Peter III. But as it turns out, and you'll remember this, Peter III is referred to as an impotent imbecile. And we've got a woman who is, I'm going to say, extremely high powered. She gets involved in some intrigue with other members of the aristocracy, the boyars, and she has her husband assassinated. And then she comes to power on her own. And then she takes the southern port, the Black Sea area from Turkey, and then she takes the part of Poland in those 3 partitions. So here we have Catherine. In 1762, Catherine II carried out a coup against her husband with the help of powerful boyars, nobles. The Russo-Turkish War, because remember, Turkey had that territory from 1768 to 1774, added Crimea and the northern Black Sea coast to Russia. Russia now had, and you get to be a great in Russia if you add territory. So she adds that second window to the west this time in the south, now enabling Russian ships to go through the Straits of the Bosporus, through the Turkish Straits, and to get out to the Mediterranean Sea. So enabling access to the sea. The prize was Odessa, a good deep water port. Okay, now we go ahead, now we grab the northern portion of Ukraine. Due to the territorial ambitions of Prussia, Austria, and Russia, the country of Poland disappeared from the map of Europe in 3 partitions. Catherine the Great took part in all 3, and much of present-day northern Ukraine came under Russian rule. Now again, we're fast forwarding. You might be wondering, well, how do they get the rest of this territory? Most of this territory out here, if you think about it, we're in Siberia, is empty. So once the Russians build up their army, they basically just run all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And Russia, still the biggest country in the world, when it was the Soviet Union with all of these 15 republics that made it up, was 1/6 of the Earth's territory. Now, Russia today has its most important port, you've heard me say it, Vladivostok, and this is where the Russians have their nuclear fleet. So you can see how close they are to Japan. And by the way, the Russians now in trouble in Ukraine have been actually shipping material from Vladivostok. We got this news from the Japanese as they came through the straits. I do want to mention Japan since I'm supposed to be teaching about it. All right. So let's jump then to 1914. All right, maybe we need some other maps. So let's take a look second at this map. Okay, can everybody see this map? This is the map of Europe after the Great Northern War. So the year is 1722. So this is right after Russia has taken St. Petersburg. Okay, and here is Poland. And this part is called Lithuania. So it was the merging of the Polish and the Lithuanian crowns that created this giant country. This is the country that gets divided up. Prussia gets this part, Austria gets this part, and Poland gets this part. And just to kind of, if I can find it, I should be able to find Kyiv, but I can't. Okay, so basically Poland is gone. Now, World War I, let's go to that map, okay? Now, this is a map that's showing you the sides in the war. But I want you to note, Russia has Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia up here. It also has control over much of Poland. So this basically to here is Russia. Russia, Great Britain, France, and the Italians a little bit late, but still, they are the Allied powers, and they're fighting against the Central powers, Central Europe, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Turk Empire. So basically, these were the sides. What I really wanted you to see at this point is that here we have Ukraine. Ukraine is pretty much all Russian. Up here, this is Minsk, and this is, of course, today, the capital of Belarus. Okay, so let's go to World War I. In 1914, Russia entered World War I. But in 1917, the Communist Bolshevik Revolution took place. Russia dropped out of the war and ceded most of its European territories to Germany. Now, we don't usually hear about this because if you imagine Russia loses, here is Germany. Basically, the Germans took all of this territory and absorbed it into Germany. However, Germany loses in World War I. So you're not going to allow the Germans to keep all this territory. And so it really is after World War I that many of the countries we know today that are in Eastern Europe gained their independence. They gained that independence at the Treaty, or the Peace of Paris, which ended the First World War. Most people think of the Treaty of Versailles, and that would be accurate, but that is specifically a treaty between Russia and Germany, not the other powers. So the Treaty of Versailles kind of creates all of these Eastern European countries that we are familiar with today. So let's pick it out. Russia dropped, we got that, however, okay. So however, in 1918, Germany lost World War I and was forced to give up the territory. As a result, Poland was restored as a sovereign nation. So that is why Poland comes back as a country. Let me see, how about we try this map? This will show you Eastern Europe. Okay. Yes? All right. Now, during the Communist Revolution of 1917, and if you can try to channel Dr. Zhivago, you'll remember that the communists come to power. They are people from the working class, and they don't trust anybody who is in the middle class nor the upper class, because they're fearful that they will want what we call in history a restoration. A restoration would mean restoring the monarchy, the monarchists. They would want to bring back, let's say, Nicholas II. So in order to get rid of all of their enemies, they carry out what we call the Red Terror. And they put many, many, many people to death. So the Europeans, now that they take, the territory away from Russia, they set up what is known in history as the cordon sanitaire, the sanitary corridor. The idea was, let's create a lot of buffer countries right up against the Russian border to contain the spread of communism. That's the goal. I know the time. I'm just going to try to finish this and then we'll break. Okay, so from 1918 to 22, Russia then had a civil war. The civil war was between those that wanted to restore the monarchy, and they are called the whites because the color of monarchy is white. And they are fighting against the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks are the Reds. So the Bolsheviks are successful in the revolution. The Red Terror, which purged all opponents of the newly established USSR, convinced the West to establish this cordon sanitaire, an Eastern European buffer zone to prevent the spread of Russian influence in Western Europe. Now, you have to kind of imagine, if they're in the midst of a civil war, what that means is that the whole country is imploding. So Ukraine, right here, takes the opportunity to become independent for about 3 years. But when the war ends, the civil war ends in 1922, the Russians will reconquer the Ukraine and will reabsorb Ukraine back into Russia. And let's see if this makes sense. From 1918 to 22, Russia endured a civil war between the whites, the monarchists wishing to restore Romanov rule, and the Reds, the Bolsheviks forces. The Bolsheviks were successful. The Red Terror, which purged all opponents in the newly established USSR, I read this, apologize. I should listen to myself. All right, I meant to go to L. From roughly 1917 to 1920, Ukraine remained an independent state. In 1922, it became part of the USSR after suffering a forced famine by Russia. So that's how they got Ukraine. Because the USSR was so large, the republics making up the country had a great deal of autonomy. I mean, obviously, no one can rule over a sixth of the earth in a country that is made up of well over 100 nationalities. So basically, when they created the Soviet Union, they divided Russia into 15 or 13, initially 12 independent, not independent, like states that were part of the Soviet Union, but were given a great deal of local rule. So that's basically what happened. All right, now, I also want to just mention a little bit about the history of Ukraine as it applies to the Jewish population. Some of you may remember that in the late 1800s, the Russians started to segregate the Jewish population, and they moved them pretty much into the area we know as Ukraine. This area, which also encompasses parts of Poland, is known as the Pale. So if you've ever wondered where that area is, this was the area. So many of the people who are being starved to death by the Russians, they're part of this Jewish population. But of course, this is only the first time they forced a famine on Ukraine. And I might add that one reason why Hitler and Russia and everybody's interested in Ukraine is because Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. 71% of this country is arable land. They made their living farming and they needed the food. And some may recall that the state flag of, or excuse me, the state flower of Ukraine is the sunflower. And the sunflower, of course, is the state flower for Kansas. And the Chinese import virtually all of their sunflower oil from Ukraine. All right, so I want to mention Asia every so often here. Okay, so here we go. A second famine was imposed by Russia in 1932-33 by Joseph Stalin, who succeeded Lenin. I'm looking at the clock and I'm apologizing, but it makes sense to just, no, it doesn't. I'm going to shut up. And I'm going to give everybody a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll dive back into all of this. And I apologize for going late. All right? Too much. What?
How do you force a famine? I thought a famine happened because of weather.
You know, I was afraid somebody would ask me that. I don't know how they did it. I tried to look up everything, but this wasn't the focus. Good. Am I turned off? Maybe I can just say hello to all my friends out there. Hi, Bela. It's good to see people. I can't hear you, but it is good to see you. That's okay. I need to really shut up for a minute. Yeah. I know. So good to see you, of course. But not actually till you got up here. I'm
more comfortable with it.
I am too.
Okay, so you said that the Russian nobles didn't want to get somebody from their own group, so they got McCavitt.
Right.
But from whence did he come?
He was a member of the royal family.
Take your mask off. So I can hear you.
Okay. Michael Romanov was the son of a noble.
Oh, he was?
Oh, yeah. You would never, I mean, it had to be somebody that of the educated.
Son of a noble,
Yes.
But one of the nobles that they felt.
Right. But that's why they got somebody so young. They felt he had not yet been over influenced by political
Okay.
issues.
In Ukraine, I mean, in Crimea, the
Mhm.
port of Sevastopol.
Right.
Did the Russians have control of that port before 2014? I mean,
Yes.
in recent history?
They,
They had a.
yeah, could we just turn this off for a second? Thanks. Crimea is transferred to Ukraine in 1954. In 1991, Ukraine gets its independence. Crimea belonged to Ukraine, but the leader of Ukraine made a lease agreement. Lori, am I on? Okay, great. Okay, over here we kind of have the historical makeup of Ukraine, and I'm not going to go all through this, but I think a couple of things. 1922 kind of represents the end of the civil war in Russia at the end of World War II. And in 1922, Ukraine is defeated by the Russians. We said there was just a famine, and then Ukraine becomes one of the republics in the USSR. So that's what that date refers to. The date up here, this giant green area, this represents the amount of territory that had been taken by Catherine the Great with the partition of Poland. So that's the northern portion. Most of this southern area, remember, was taken by Russia under Catherine the Great, so much of this actually was already intact. And 1954 is in reference to Nikita Khrushchev, who is a Ukrainian who made the decision to give Ukraine control over Crimea, never ever anticipating that somehow in the future the USSR would simply implode and that Ukraine would become an independent country. So that's where we are there. All right, so we are picking up at the second famine. I was going to do a little bit of the history of Russia at this point. Vladimir Lenin is, of course, the leader of the Russian Revolution, and he comes after being in exile in the West. He returns to Russia, he carries out the Bolshevik Revolution, and he rules in Russia with two of his cohorts, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. During the Civil War, Trotsky is the person that we associate most with the Red Army. He is the one who ran the army. And after Lenin dies slightly after the revolution in 1924. He died of a stroke, and a power struggle took place between Stalin and Trotsky. Stalin wins the power struggle. Trotsky leaves the country, heads to Mexico, has an affair with Frida Kahlo, and dies there in 1940. All right, assassinated, by the way, assassinated in Mexico. The Russians have been at this assassination game, I think, for a very, very long time. So in any case, this civil war period in Russia goes from roughly 1924, the death of Lenin, until 1928. In 1928, Trotsky takes off. So in 1928, for all real purposes, we now have Stalin in power, and he is trying to consolidate the state and one of the places that he wants to bring under his control is the Ukraine. So here we see in letter M. A second, and I was asked the question and I dreaded it, and it was asked, how did he force the famine? And I just have to say, I don't know. And since it wasn't the focus of my lesson, even though I knew it was sticking up out there and someone would ask, I said, I just have to spend my time and keep my eye, or I'll be at this till I'm 100. So anyway, I don't know how he forced the famine. Oh, so how did they force the famine? Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I guess that forces a famine. So, all right. So let's pick that up. A second forced famine was imposed by Russia in 1932 to 1933, Stalin in power, who succeeded Lenin. It's estimated, and look at that figure, 8 million people died in Ukraine as a result of both of those famines carried out by the Russians. If you wonder why the Ukrainians want their independence, I assure you they know their history. Okay, let's pick it up at letter N. In World War II, the USSR was instrumental in defeating Nazi Germany by sending its troops west, right? Let's see, do we have another map? Oh. Ugh. No, okay. Let me go back to the World War I map, because it's the best I've got. It's not. I started to get embarrassed about how many maps I was asking to reproduce. Where am I? All right, let's think about how the war is going in World War II. In World War II, Germany in the middle is being hit from the west, and it is being hit from the east. Eventually, the Russians in all these Central European states, they begin to occupy this territory, and they begin to occupy about 1/3 of what is today Germany. We have called this for many years East Germany. So they get 1/3 of Germany. Now, everybody expects when you've got an invading army and they're taking over independent sovereign states, that at some time they're going to go home. So Stalin basically liberates these countries from Nazi control, but then, like the man who came to dinner, he just stays in the region. Once the United States and the other Western European nations realize that he's not getting out of Eastern Europe, we decide in 1949 to prevent further Russian aggression to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And that said more or less that if any attack came on any member of NATO, all members of NATO would act collectively to fight against the Soviet Union. And that's pretty much where we are. Okay. Unwilling to relinquish its control over the areas it occupied after the war, it established Soviet satellite states ruled by, and important to know, national leaders. So the countries like of Hungary and Poland, their leaders are Polish and Hungarian, but they are actually puppets of the Russian, the Soviet Union. So they did the bidding of the Soviet Union. Okay, Churchill referred to them as being behind the Iron Curtain. In response, the West created NATO, a military alliance that today includes 27 European countries, the United States in North America, Canada in North America, and Turkey in Asia. Each member has agreed to defend each other in retaliation to an attack by an outside power. An attack on one is an attack on all. So this is what we call a defensive pact. If any one of the countries that are members of NATO attack another country, NATO does not have to go to their aid. But if they are attacked, then NATO is supposed to respond as a group. Now, as soon as that, as the nations in Eastern Europe get their independence in 1991, when the Soviet Union just kind of collapses, they want to, of course, be sure that they never, ever again are going to fall under Russian rule. And they consider themselves to be sovereign states. And a sovereign state should be free to determine their own foreign policy. So immediately upon gaining their independence, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they start applying to get into NATO in order to be sure that Russia doesn't try to regain them. Poland became a member of NATO in 1999. So now you can see one of the reasons why when we end up ultimately with a Western looking ruler, a guy like Zelensky, that Russia would be concerned that Ukraine, who they consider like their brothers, they say, because they're both of Slavic background, they have lots of families in both countries, they both had the beginnings of their country in Kievan Rus and all of that. So they just felt they couldn't let Ukraine go to the West. So that's that argument. Now, other members in Eastern Europe that have also joined NATO include Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, Slovenia, Slovakia. So basically, if you look at who Putin is, I would describe him as a reactionary. A reactionary is somebody who wants to turn the clock back. So his quest, and he sees it almost as a mystical quest to kind of somehow put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And he created, after the fall in 1991, what they called the Russian Federation. And some of the old Soviet republics chose to join up with the Russian Federation. Among those countries is Belarus, which is right on top, which is being ruled by Lukashenko, which is where the Minsk agreements and everything else. And I heard today that it is possible that Belarus is going to join the war with Russia. The Russians are losing the ground war because, believe me, they are armed to the teeth. The United States has given $2.5 billion in military aid to Ukraine. That doesn't even take into consideration what they're getting from other nations, the other NATO nations. This is us alone. So when you are an invading army and you are in armored personnel carriers or you're in a tank, and now the Ukrainian people are carrying out guerrilla warfare and they're armed to the teeth, these guys are sitting ducks coming down the road, and all of their initiatives have been interrupted. Russia has not been successful in taking any major city. They are pounding Mariupol into the ground because, as I said, I think their real goal is to reclaim that seacoast, to have that land bridge. So that's pretty much what's happening. All right, so we create NATO in 1949, and the Russians don't immediately react by organizing their group into a pact, in part because they don't trust them. they're not sure that they're going to support the USSR. But in 1955, they create the Warsaw Pact. And that has the same basic principles as the NATO agreement, that an attack on any Warsaw nation would be an attack on all Warsaw nations. So in 1991, the USSR suffered an economic collapse brought on largely by its inability to keep up with the military buildup under President Reagan. In the early 1980s, we embarked on a nuclear arms race. You have to imagine that we are the richest country in the world and that we could afford this arms race. Russia was not a very rich country. So if you look at their GDP, they're having to use a much higher percentage of their GDP in order to go toe-to-toe with NATO. Ultimately, their economy collapses. And this is what we're doing now. We have basically declared economic warfare on Russia, and we have cut them out from the SWIFT system, which gives them access to international banking. We have cut, the only thing the Russians really have is oil. The other thing they have, I should mention, is military hardware. They are the second largest military hardware producer, weapons producer in the world. So what is Russia? It's a militarized state with state-of-the-art weapons, but obviously, based on the poor performance of their troops, they were not spending a lot of money training those troops and making sure that they were battle ready. All of that costs quite a bit of money. So they export arms. One of their biggest customers is India. And that helps to explain why when the UN tried to get a General Assembly resolution passed, certain countries with strong economic ties to Russia tended to abstain. Even China abstained. A few of the African countries actually voted with, I think Eritrea voted to against the resolution. So let me pick up. So we could, by the way, destroy the Russian economy again. I don't know how much to go into all of this, but let me leave it at that for now, and I'll pick that theme up again a little bit later. So as a result, the Eastern European satellites after 1991 became truly independent. So that means that Ukraine has been a completely independent country for basically the last 30 years. The Warsaw Pact ended, obviously, with the dissolution of the USSR, and the republics within the USSR gained their independence. So now 15 republics are independent. Russia, of course, is one, and they have been kind of pared back to simply Russia. And all of the Eastern European puppet states, the satellites, now are free to develop their own foreign policy. All right. Now, I was in Russia and in Kyiv in 1991. And I'm trying to kind of set the stage for the fact that this is basically, at least in 1991, a pretty corrupt country. Russia was corrupt. When I was there in 1991, there was really nothing to buy. The country was really falling apart economically. The only people who were really enterprising were the people who were in the black market. I'm going to suggest that these are the kinds of people who were the early capitalists who were violating the law in Russia by selling private goods and being private owners of businesses. So these are the oligarchs, in the sense that had their earliest beginnings under the corrupt Russian regime, because they found ways to make a dollar. When I was in Russia, a can of caviar was $10 American. I went to Kyiv, and by day, it was a hotel. I'm in Russia with about 30 students from the high school where I taught. And by night, it was a red light district. It was a brothel. And I mean, there's no drinking laws in Russia about how old you have to be. And so I had to spend my whole night basically in the brothel trying to keep my students out. So that was a very long night, is all I'll say about that. Okay, so where are we? Thank you. This will keep me from repeating myself. Many of the newly independent republics were poor, undemocratic, and absent of civil liberties. Corruption was endemic, which stalled economic reforms. This was the state of Ukraine in 1991. Okay, am I actually done with the history? Ooh, all right, well, let us then move along to the geography and demography of Ukraine. Everybody got that? So this is going to give you kind of a present day idea of what Ukraine is like. And if it's necessary, I'll elaborate. So first we say it's located on the 49th line of latitude. We are at the 35th line of latitude. So that gives you some idea. It is further north. Oh, and I heard some more news this morning. The Russian troops that are in there didn't bring warm clothes. They thought that they were going to be in and out. They thought Ukraine would fold. And the fact that it didn't meant that they are now suffering from frostbite. So that's the state of their troops. Located at 49 degrees north latitude, Ukraine is approximately the size of Texas. Currently, about 7% of the country is occupied by Russia, including Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk. Okay, Ukraine has more than 1,700 miles of seacoast on the Black Sea that was gained by Catherine the Great. Historically, Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of Europe. About 71% of the country is made up of fertile fields. Natural resources include iron, coal, manganese, natural gas, oil, and salt. The densest population is in the Donbas region, which is made up of, and they call them oblasts, the oblasts of Luhansk and Donetsk. These regions are principally Russian-speaking, and they border Russia. However, the country has been independent for 30 years. So when we look at the population today, a number of the people living in the Donbas identify as Ukrainians, while others continue to identify as Russian. I would say that the native language of the people that live in the Donbas, their first language is Russian, just as Zelensky's native language is Russian.
Where's the Donbas?
It's Luhansk. Oh, let me. Oh, I gotta. My first day. Okay. Okay. All right. This is the Donbas. This is Luhansk. This is Donetsk. So right up against Russia and pro-Russian in the cities. But remember, they gained autonomy, but not independence. And so it's important to realize that while the cities were largely Russian strongholds, the Ukrainian army is in both of these provinces and was occupying these provinces because it was their country. So there's a lot of fighting going on there. All right. So to make this make sense, I tried to give you some figures. The densest population is in the Donbass region, which is made up of Luhansk and Donetsk. These regions are principally Russian-speaking and border Russia. The two major cities in each region are also called Luhansk and Donetsk. The city of Luhansk has a population of 400,000 and identifies with Russia. The region of Luhansk has a population of 2,500,000. The southern part of the region identifies as Russian, while the northern part of Luhansk identifies itself as Ukrainian. And now going to the Donetsk region. And Donetsk, the city, is among the largest cities in Ukraine. The Donetsk region has a population of 4,100,000. Approximately 2,700,000, or 57, a majority of the population, identifies as Ukrainian. 38% of the population, or 1.8 million, identify as Russian. The city of Donetsk has a population of about 1 million, and with another 1.5 million in the metropolitan area. Donetsk is among the largest cities in Ukraine. Crimea was transferred to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954. It is predominantly Russian in ethnicity. Its population is approximately 2.4 million, with approximately 1 million people in Sevastopol, down in the bottom. All right, now to take a look at some demography. The population of the country is 44 million. The urban population is 70%. Kyiv is the largest city with about 3 million. Kharkiv, where there's lots of fighting right near the Russian border, has 1.5 million. They have not taken that city. Odessa has approximately 1 million, and Donetsk has approximately 1 million. So these are the biggest cities. The ethnicity, 78% of the people living in the country identify as Ukrainian, and 17% identify as Russian. The languages spoken predominantly is going to be Ukrainian, and then obviously the second language would be Russian. The life expectancy is 68 years old with a median age of 40. It is a declining population because there are very few economic opportunities, and consequently, population has been leaving primarily to go west, because the Russian economy has been pretty poor over the years, and the economic opportunities were in the EU nations of Europe. Now, I wanted to also, and I didn't put this in your notes, but I wanted to just share a little bit of a comparison with Russia. So, you know, if there's a question, you can certainly jump in and ask. The Russian Federation has approximately 146 million people. It is the 11th largest economy in the world, but I am telling you, it is only the size of Italy or Spain. So if you don't think that we couldn't destroy the economies of Spain or Italy, you'd be mistaken. But then you'd say you're really hurting the Russian people. what do you really want to do? And what happens if you destroy their economy? And, you know, a guy like Putin, who's got chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons that he has somewhat indicated he might use rather than lose this war. You know, what do you do with a guy like Putin who you really don't know what his reaction would be if his economy was truly, if it truly disintegrated? Basically, if we're looking at the history of Russia, when Russia became, when the Soviet Union collapsed in '91, the ruler in Russia at the time was Gorbachev, and then followed by Yeltsin. And Yeltsin is the one who appointed Putin. And in 2002, Putin came to power. And I'm sure you all know that Putin's background is in the intelligence services, and that used to be called the KGB. We call it today the FSB. I don't remember what that acronym stands for, but basically with this kind of Secret Service background, and basically think about it, no money. So he can't really confront the United States head on, and he has relied in large part on espionage and basically trying to create disorder in Western Europe by interfering with elections. I think there's pretty good evidence. He was behind Brexit. He wanted to divide Great Britain and get them to get out of NATO. We know that he got involved in our own election. So, you know, so he uses low-cost methods in order to kind of sow dissent. That's who he is. That's his background. One story that most people tend to remember is that when he met with Angela Merkel and he knew she was frightened of dogs, he attended the meeting with her with a giant dog at his side. The guy, you know, it's psychological war. Who does these things? That's why I say, who knows what this guy would do if cornered? All right. As I said earlier, they are the second largest arms dealer in the world, second only to the United States. Their wealth is in oil. The cost of oil is up. Consequently, he has had petrodollars. However, major American and foreign oil companies have shut down importation of Russian oil. You'll recall that there was something called Nord Stream 2, which is a pipeline that was supposed to open between Russia and Germany so that they could get their oil directly. The German government shocked everybody by pulling out of that agreement the moment that invasion took place. So I don't think there's anything else I have to say about it. So, the Constitution. The Constitution, as it was written after 1991, allowed for 2 terms in office. He had those 2 terms, but of course he didn't want to leave. So instead, he got his party, I think is Russia Unite, his party, the largest party in the Duma, they elected Medvedev to be their prime minister. And then when Putin couldn't be president, Putin got Medvedev made president for 1 term. And then I guess their constitution permitted it. He then came back. Then they changed the constitution. And now it appears he can pretty much stay in power like a czar. Like a czar. And what will make him great? Reconstituting the old Soviet Union. Okay. So much for Russia. Setting the stage for the current Russo Ukrainian war. Is there anybody who has any questions? Is there anything that you would like to ask me?
Very quickly turn on the seal mics before.
Oh. Anybody out there? Anybody?
Talk to a green circle.
Anybody have a question out there?
There's a circle.
Tell them to unmute themselves.
Oh, I guess you have to unmute yourself. I was just told that. All right, then, we're gonna slog ahead. If you're still with me, we got another 10 minutes. Let's set the stage for the war that is currently taking place now in 2022. In 2004, there was what is called an Orange Revolution. Some of you may have heard the offhand remark that all of these autocrats are fearful of color revolutions. That's because, generally speaking, a color revolution is a revolution against the existing regime, which is being ruled by an autocrat. So, in 2004, there is an Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Mass protests broke out after the presidential election of a pro-Russian leader. That leader, and this is the leader that is now in Russia today, that flees in 2014. So this revolution is the first revolution against that guy. His name is Yanukovych, all right? So they claimed in 2004 that in order to get elected, Yanukovych basically packed the ballot box. He also was living a life of extreme luxury and wealth, again, with a palace that, well, I don't want to say rivals Putin's, that he claims belongs to the state. You may know that Navalny, one of the reasons Navalny got into so much trouble is because he began to put online all of the wealth that had been amassed by Putin. And among that wealth were this incredible palace that he has, that he then was forced to respond to by stating that, you know, this was the presidential palace, so to speak, and that it belonged to the Russian people. Sure, some think he may be the wealthiest man in the world. All of the oligarchs in Russia owe their position to him. All he has to do is to turn against them and they will lose their wealth. That's why they're standing with him now. They feel they really don't have too much choice. And then when you think about the Russian people themselves, he has attempted to control thought in the country. And he was reasonably successful, but not nearly as successful as the Chinese have been. And I might add, he is trying to buy all the Chinese technology in order to further control any kinds of propaganda. So basically, it's a closed society. All right, so Yanukovych, anyway, is involved in election fraud. The people are aware of the fraud and there are mass demonstrations against it. They decide to hold new elections that are going to be monitored internationally. And this, I hate to do this to you with these names, which is why I haven't mentioned them before. It brought Viktor Yushchenko. Sounds just like Viktor Yanukovych. I don't write the history, a reformer to power. So this guy, Yushchenko, was now going to be pro-West, and we are in the year 2004. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians, with almost no experience in democracy, they start to fight among themselves, and it's very complicated, and I'm not going to get into it because it doesn't matter. We're simply going to say internal party squabbling preceded the parliamentary elections that took place in 2006. The parliament in Ukraine is called the Rada. It's the Rada. There's a long name, but everybody calls it the Rada. In 2006, the Rada, now this is in the parliament, swept the party of Yanukovych, the pro-Russian, into power. So that means that they were the party with the highest number of seats in the parliament, which means the largest party chooses the prime minister. So the prime minister is like Nancy Pelosi, controls the Congress, the parliament, but the president is now a pro-Russian government. So you've got basically control of two parts of the government. You have control of the executive branch, and now you have control of the legislative branch, which means that in theory, they're going to start to move to be closer to Russia. Okay. All right. So in 2000, so he becomes the prime minister. In 2008, Ukraine applied to initiate its membership in NATO. This is because their economy was in trouble. The Russians really were not a growing economy. There were periods, certainly, when oil was not in high demand, and the economic opportunities were to the West. So they applied for membership in 2008. In 2010, Yanukovych was elected president, and he ended that effort to join the EU. Ukraine goes back to claiming that they are he kind of reasserts they are a non-aligned state. In 2012, Ukraine and the European Union initiated an association agreement. An association agreement is the earliest steps of trying to gain membership into the EU. Western economies provided greater opportunities for growth. To join the Ukraine would have to end the corruption that I've alluded to, and there are oligarchs as well in Ukraine. They come from a background of Soviet domination. And they were told that if they wanted to join, they had to be willing to make economic reforms, very much like trying to get a loan from the IMF. You only want to loan money to people that have an economy that tells you they're going to be able to pay it back. The 2012 election to the Rada were internationally criticized as flawed due to government interference once again by Yanukovych's party. So election fraud in 2012. We're moving toward 2014 when they grabbed Crimea. In 2013, Russia voiced concern about Ukraine's drift to the West and modified its ties to Ukraine. Ukraine's big trading partner was Russia. So Russia is kind of carrying out economic warfare toward Ukraine. And what they did was they began to restrict the import and exports of goods. I'm going to shut up. It is 12 o'clock. We will come back. We'll do the revolution or the grabbing of Crimea in 2014. And then we will bring this completely up to date. Come with questions. At some point, what I really want to do is have a class discussion. Unfortunately, it really looks like this is going to go on for a while. They said that the Poles were preparing for a migration of as many as 5 million people. And they are bombing everything. And they have used a hypersonic weapon. I don't know if you saw that, but we talked about that in this class. These weapons move at Mach 5 speed. They're the fastest weapons. We don't have them. The Russians have them, the Chinese. They are able to adjust their flight. There is no good reason for him to abuse them. He's using them against a stable, a target, ammunition dump. He's trying to give morale boost to the troops on the ground that are losing. So he's bombing them from the Black Sea. He's bombing them from the periphery, and he's sending these high-tech weapons to be intimidating. And we can't predict what he's going to do.
I just have to say thank you. You really helped me understand what I'm listening to and watching.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
I really
did
think,
help.
don't we really have to understand a guy who's
Really
threatening nuclear? Great. Then you've made me feel
Well,
less
I can
guilty
get to the
of
next
changing the
week now.
curriculum
Oh,
on
yeah.
the spot. And I will stay on top of this, and we will see where it goes, okay?
Thank you.
Carl,